Imagine this. You're walking down the bustling streets of ancient Rome in 67 AD when you come across a scene that chills you to the bone. The emperor himself, Nero, is casually strolling through the forum. Beside him is a beautiful young woman wrapped in silk and glittering jewels. But behind them, quiet murmurs ripple through the crowd. Everyone knows the dark secret. That elegant woman beside the world's most powerful man was once a boy named Sporus. What Nero did to him stands among the most shocking cases of emotional and physical torment ever recorded. Before we explore these lost tales of pain and endurance, if diving into hidden corners of history fascinates you, don't forget to tap the like button and subscribe for more stories like this. And drop a comment below. Tell me where you're tuning in from. It amazes me that we're uncovering these ancient truths together from across the globe, linked through time and curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of Roman indulgence. It's a story where power twists love into obsession, turns sorrow into insanity, and reshapes a human life into a puppet for one man's dark desire. You may not know the name Sporus, but his story will stay with you long after this ends. Let's begin with the man who would shape this entire Nero. He wasn't born a monster. In fact, his early rule held great promise. When he took the throne at just 16, many in Rome believed a golden era was beginning. He lowered taxes, funded public shows, and even took part in stage performances that thrilled everyday citizens. But absolute power has a way of poisoning even the brightest hopes. And by 65 AD, something deep inside Nero had unraveled. Maybe it was the endless fear of knowing everyone around him wanted his throne. Maybe it was the crushing loneliness of being the one man ruling 60 million others. A man who could never be questioned, never corrected, never told he was wrong. Or maybe the crack came when he lost the one person he claimed to love more than life itself. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and she seemed to be everything Nero ever dreamed of. Strikingly beautiful, sharp enough to mirror his own ego, and bold enough to chase visions of eternal fame right beside him. But Poppaea wasn't just another face in Rome's imperial palace. She had a sharp political mind, one that could be either a powerful partner or a deadly threat. When Nero first saw her, he was already wed to Octavia, daughter of the former emperor. It was a cold, strategic match without passion. Poppaea was everything Octavia wasn't. Where Octavia was quiet and careful, Poppaea was bold and captivating. Where Octavia faded into the background, Poppaea lit up every room. What began between Nero and Poppaea started like any scandal in ancient Rome. But what began as an affair soon spiraled into something far more dangerous: true obsession. Nero wasn't just drawn to Poppaea's beauty. He was utterly consumed by her, in a way that even frightened those closest to him. Ancient writers describe his behavior at this time as increasingly unstable and controlling. He'd erupt in violent fury if another man looked at Poppaea for too long. At public events, he placed guards around her, supposedly for her safety, but in truth, to watch her every move. He showered her with gifts that drained the empire's wealth: jewels from India, silks from China, and fragrances from Arabia. But the clearest sign of how far he'd gone: he began bending reality to match his obsession. First, he divorced Octavia, a shocking decision that cost him much public support. Then he declared he would marry Poppaea in a grand imperial ceremony. The wedding was a display of unmatched extravagance, with Nero pouring out vast wealth to prove his devotion. But even marriage wasn't enough to satisfy his need to fully control Poppaea. He started cutting her off from those closest to her, keeping her away from friends and family. Around her, he placed only those whose power depended entirely on his approval. He ordered countless portraits and statues of her, not just to show off in public, but for his private rooms so he could stare at her image even when she wasn't there. Ancient accounts say Nero would spend hours watching Poppaea as she went through her daily routine. This wasn't love in any real sense. It was obsession disguised as devotion. He didn't see her as a person with a will of her own, but as a flawless possession, existing only to please him. Poppaea, for her part, knew exactly what she was dealing with. She was clever enough to see that Nero's obsession gave her rare influence, and wise enough to know it came with serious danger. She used that power to push her family's interests forward, building alliances to protect herself in case Nero's love turned cold. But Poppaea made one crucial mistake. She wasn't afraid to defy him, unlike everyone else in the palace. While everyone else had learned to tiptoe around Nero's shifting moods, Poppaea kept her fierce sense of self. She challenged his decisions, openly questioned his artistic passions, and even mocked his stage performances when they didn't impress her. The exact events of that tragic day in 65 AD depend on which ancient writer you follow, but the end result is always the same. What began as a routine domestic dispute, some say over Nero returning late from the races, others blame his obsession with theater, turned into something far darker. In that moment, the emperor snapped in a way that would leave a scar on his soul. According to Tacitus, the fight took a darker turn when Poppaea dared to question Nero's priorities, hinting that he cared more about fame than about being a husband or a father. She was pregnant then, expecting what would have been their second child. Maybe the pressure of it all made her less willing to put up with Nero's unstable moods. What happened after has sparked debate among historians for centuries. But most agree on this: in a sudden, violent outburst, Nero either kicked or hit his pregnant wife with such force that it caused fatal internal injuries. Some accounts say it was one vicious blow to the stomach. Others describe a prolonged assault that left her bleeding and unconscious on the cold marble floor. Picture the moment Nero grasped what he had done. The man who ruled 30 legions, who could sentence anyone to death with a single word, who was worshipped as a living god in the eastern provinces, had just destroyed the only thing he truly loved. The woman he had obsessed over was now dying, all because of his own uncontrolled rage. Ancient writers call the scene that followed one of the most pitiful in the empire's history. Nero is said to have collapsed beside Poppaea's body, switching between begging for her forgiveness and demanding that she live, as if even death could be overruled by the command of an emperor. He called for the finest doctors in Rome, offering them riches to save her, and threatening torture if they failed. But it was no use. Poppaea died within hours, taking with her the unborn child who might have been Nero's heir. In that moment, something inside the emperor completely unraveled. His grief went beyond heartbreak. It became a full break from reality. Nero's mourning became infamous. He refused to have Poppaea's body cremated, defying Roman tradition. Instead, he had her embalmed and buried in a tomb more lavish than those of past emperors. He declared her a goddess, formed a cult in her name, and spent hours speaking to her corpse, as if she were still alive and listening. The imperial court now found itself walking a far more dangerous line. Courtiers were expected to play along with the illusion that Poppaea was somehow still alive, speaking of her in the present tense and keeping her favorite seat vacant at royal feasts. Anyone who dared suggest that Nero should move on was instantly exiled, or worse. It was during this strange and fragile period that Sporus first caught Nero's attention, though the boy had no idea he was stepping into a nightmare. Sporus was likely around 14 or 15 at the time. Born into slavery within the imperial household and freed as a child, he grew up behind palace walls, educated for roles in administration that actually placed him in a somewhat privileged position. Freedmen serving the emperor often lived more comfortably than many free citizens in lower social ranks. But that privilege came with total reliance on the emperor's favor. Freedmen owed everything to the generosity of their former master, leaving them completely exposed. They could rise to great power, but just as easily be cast aside, punished, or even killed without warning or legal protection. What drew Nero to Sporus wasn't his education or talents. It was his appearance. Several ancient accounts agree the boy looked strikingly like the late Poppaea, especially his eyes and delicate features. In a world where Romans believed that physical likeness hinted at a deeper, even spiritual link, this resemblance was impossible for Nero to ignore. The resemblance would have felt almost otherworldly the first time Nero laid eyes on Sporus after Poppaea's death. Something shifted in the shattered corners of the emperor's mind. Here was a chance to undo the damage, to reclaim what he had destroyed. The likeness was so vivid, so uncanny, that for a brief moment, Nero may have truly believed. He believed he was seeing Poppaea's spirit reborn in a new body. Of course, there was one glaring issue: Sporus was male. But for a man who thought himself a god, who had spent months speaking to a corpse, changing someone's gender felt like a small detail. What followed stands as one of the most deliberate acts of cruelty ever recorded. Nero didn't just demand that Sporus wear women's clothing. He decided the change would be permanent. He summoned Rome's top physicians and commanded them to perform surgery on the boy, solely to make him appear more feminine. This wasn't just mutilation, it was the deliberate erasure of Sporus's identity as a person. The procedure was brutal, risky, and permanent. Many didn't survive it, often dying from infection or blood loss. But even if Sporus lived through it, he would be changed forever, in body, in mind, and in status. He would never have children, never know a normal relationship, and never again be seen as fully male by Roman standards. The surgery was carried out inside the imperial palace, in chambers specially prepared for this purpose. Ancient surgery was crude at best, using simple tools and barely effective anesthetics. The procedure would have been agonizing, stretching on for hours with a high chance of death. Sporus would have been pinned down by guards as doctors moved in with their blades, fully aware that his screams would go ignored. Once he recovered, a process that could take weeks or even months, Nero made an announcement that stunned even the most hardened members of Rome's elite. Nero declared he would marry the young man in a grand imperial wedding. The event took months to plan and swallowed huge amounts of state wealth. Sporus was renamed Sabina, after the late empress, and placed in private quarters arranged specifically for him. There, he was groomed for his new role. Imperial seamstresses created an entire wardrobe, designing gowns to suit his altered figure and conceal any trace of masculinity. Skilled jewelers crafted custom pieces just for him, many using gems that had once belonged to Poppaea herself. These weren't just ornaments. They were physical connections to the dead empress, constant reminders of the woman she had been. Sporus was being shaped into a replacement. Makeup artists trained him in beauty techniques to soften his features, teaching him how to use kohl to enlarge the eyes, rouge to bring color to the cheeks, and powders to blur masculine lines. But these weren't just lessons in appearance. They were part of a deeper, systematic erasure of who he had been. Hairdressers taught him intricate styling methods popular among elite Roman women. His hair was trimmed, curled, and styled into elaborate shapes, often decorated with expensive pieces. The routine took hours each day and required multiple attendants using heated tools. But perhaps the most damaging part of all were the lessons in how to move, speak, and behave like a woman. Sporus was given instructors who taught him how to walk, sit, and gesture in ways considered properly feminine. He learned how to hold his hands, place his feet, adjust his clothing while seated, and move through spaces with elegance rather than masculine force. Voice trainers also worked with him, helping shift his tone higher and teaching speech patterns that matched the soft, polished style expected of women in Roman high society. This was perhaps the hardest part, because vocal habits are deeply wired and incredibly difficult to change. Imagine the psychological torment of such a transformation. Each day, Sporus was made to stare into mirrors that showed a stranger wearing his face. Every lesson in feminine posture and tone reminded him that his very identity was being slowly wiped away. And every jewel that once belonged to a dead empress now felt like a chain, tying him to a role he never asked for. The wedding was set for the spring of 67 AD, time to align with religious festivals that would give it greater ceremonial meaning. Nero spared no cost, treating it as a true imperial wedding, one he believed matched the legacy of Rome's greatest rulers. The ceremony was held in the grandest hall of the palace, filled with exotic flowers and lit by thousands of oil lamps. Musicians played traditional wedding melodies while servants passed around the finest wines and rarest dishes. To anyone watching who didn't know the truth, it might have appeared just like any royal celebration. But those in the know understood they were witnessing something deeply unsettling and without precedent. Here stood the most powerful man alive, openly marrying a surgically altered teenage boy made to look like his dead wife. The ceremony followed every Roman tradition, exchanging vows, clasping hands, sharing sacred bread, and signing legal papers to make it official. The guests played along with practiced grace, offering kind words and lavish gifts, all while wearing carefully managed smiles. But the room must have been filled with an uneasy tension, a mix of horror, curiosity, and the quiet dread that comes with being part of something that feels deeply unnatural. After the wedding, Nero treated Sporus exactly as he would a real empress. The young man was given his own staff, private quarters inside the palace, and a personal income from the imperial treasury. He had a litter for travel, horses for riding, and a small entourage. But beneath all the luxury lay a terrible cost, the complete loss of his identity and the daily burden of living a role that slowly broke him. Sporus was expected to appear at public events, sit beside Nero at formal dinners, and act like a loyal wife in every setting. This wasn't just for show. Nero truly seemed to believe he had brought Poppaea back. He called Sporus by her name, spoke of shared moments that never existed, and expected him to respond as if it were all real. For Sporus, each day became a performance with no exit. One wrong move could cost him his life. Sporus had to remember not just how to look and behave like a woman, but how to react as if he truly were Poppaea. When Nero brought up moments from their former marriage, Sporus had to respond as though he remembered living them. Ancient writers say he became remarkably skilled at maintaining the illusion, developing an almost uncanny sense for reading Nero's moods and replying in ways that kept the emperor calm and satisfied. But historians also say he became more distant and sorrowful over time. Even though Sporus kept up the illusion in public without flaw, the mental burden must have been unbearable. Each morning, he woke up in rooms styled to honor a dead woman he had never even known. Every glance in the mirror showed a face that no longer felt like his own. Every conversation meant pretending to be someone else, faking memories, faking a life. For more than 2 years, Sporus survived in this strange, twisted world. But things grew even worse when Nero decided to tour Greece, chasing glory as an artist and dreaming of triumph in Greek festivals. He believed Greece would finally recognize his artistic genius. Of course, Sporus went with him, introduced to foreign leaders as Rome's empress. Picture Greek elites trying to process the sight of their conqueror parading around a teenage boy in a woman's clothes, insisting that everyone treat the illusion as fact. But by 68 AD, Nero's indulgences had gone too far. Revolts flared across the empire, led by governors fed up with his madness and neglect. The Praetorian Guard turned against him. The Senate labeled him an enemy of the state. And when Nero fled the capital with just a handful of loyalists, Sporus was still by his side, even in the face of death. The emperor couldn't abandon the one person who reminded him of Poppaea. Together, they hid in a villa just outside Rome, waiting either for rescue or arrest. Nero swung between wild escape fantasies and rehearsals for a dramatic suicide. When word arrived that his enemies were near, Nero finally chose death over capture. But his suicide left Sporus dangerously exposed. As a living symbol of Nero's twisted reign, he became both a prized possession and a dangerous reminder for the next ruler. What came next was somehow even more tragic. Sporus became a political pawn, passed between Rome's most powerful men like a prized but cursed possession. The first to claim him was Numidus Sabinus. Then he passed to Otho, and later to Vitellius, each treating him just as Nero had. They kept him dressed as a woman, still calling him by Poppaea's name. Under Vitellius, Sporus' nightmare reached its darkest point. The new emperor planned to use him as live entertainment in the Colosseum, in a staged myth meant to end in violence and public humiliation. For Sporus, this was the final breaking point, facing sexual degradation before a crowd screaming for blood. Rather than suffer that last horror, Sporus made the only real choice he'd had in years. He took his own life, likely by poison, sometime in 69 AD. He was probably no older than 20 when he died. Sporus finally escaped the grotesque performance that had consumed his life. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the brutal cost of imperial excess. Yet ancient historians rarely saw Sporus as a person. To them, he was a symbol of Roman decadence. But what makes his story so deeply haunting isn't just the abuse he suffered. It's how completely he was stripped of identity and choice. From the moment Nero saw Poppaea in his face, Sporus stopped being himself. He became a living canvas for the emperor's darkest fantasies. The fact that Sporus chose death over more humiliation shows that somewhere, buried beneath all the forced femininity and imperial control, a spark of his true self still remained. His suicide was both a tragedy and an act of defiance, a final refusal to be degraded, even if it meant ending his life. And maybe the greatest tragedy is this: we know almost nothing about who Sporus really was before all this. What were his dreams? What kind of life did he hope for? All of that vanished the moment he became Nero's living doll, replaced by a performance so complete that the boy himself disappeared. The boy who was forced to become an empress, who endured years of torment, and who ultimately chose death over more pain. His story should be remembered, not as a strange footnote in Roman history, but as a powerful reminder of both human cruelty and human strength. In choosing his own end, Sporus reclaimed the one thing he had been denied: the right to decide his own fate. His story reminds us that behind every tale of imperial glory are real people, people who suffered, endured, and deserve to be remembered, even 2,000 years later.